Hey there, students. Thank you for being part of this presentation. My name is Luis Silva, and today we're looking at world history, fighting World War One. What will we learn today? Today we're going to describe the conditions on the war front for soldiers, including the Battle of Verdun. Let's move on. From the year 1870 all the way to the year 1914, the growth of militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism increased tensions among European nations. Nationalism among Slavs in the Balkans led to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, and this basically triggered the beginning of World War One. The conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary triggered alliances and started World War One. As you can see here from this image, you see the Triple Entente, basically all the countries color-coded in red, which includes Russia, France, Britain, and the Triple Alliance, which is color-coded in blue, and it has Italy, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and later on the Ottoman Empire. Here's a political cartoon that basically demonstrates what was happening in Europe. You have Serbia, the smaller guy to the left, which basically told Austria that if he was touched, something was going to happen. And as you can see, if somebody touched Serbia, in this case Austria, then Russia was going to join in. If Russia joined in, Germany was also going to join in the fighting. And if Germany joined in, France was going to join in. So it's a combination of one event leading to another event. This is Europe before the war. You see how it is divided basically. You have Great Britain, you have France, you have Germany, you have Austria-Hungary, which is a very big nation. You have Russia and all of the other nations that became part of this war. Now this is Europe at the outbreak of World War One. You see there the Central Powers, basically made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and you also see the Allied Powers, made up of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, France, Serbia, as well as Russia. When the war began in August 1914, Europeans were very happy actually about going to fight. They actually thought that the conflict was going to be short, and they were going to be able to display all of their toys, their weapons. And obviously, as you know, this is a result of the Industrial Revolution that made possible the development of new technology, in particular technology that would kill, hurt other people. And here you have to the left French recruits, to the right you have German recruits. They seemed happy, they seemed joyful that they were going to go ahead and face each other. Most people anticipated that the war would be over by Christmas 1914, and I can tell you they were completely wrong. When the war began, Germany's biggest problem was the potential of fighting on two fronts. They did not want to actually fight on the Western Front and then on the Eastern Front against the Russians, which would create a big problem for them, and it actually did. Germany's solution was the Schifflet Plan, which involved quickly defeating France in the west, then right after that sending troops to the east before Russia was fully mobilized for war. The Schifflet Plan seemed to be working when the German army marched through Belgium and France within miles of Paris. But English and French troops saved Paris at the Battle of the Marne. Meanwhile, Russia mobilized faster than expected, so Germany had to divert troops from France so they could go ahead and start the fighting in Russia. Because the Schifflet Plan failed, the Central Powers were forced to fight a two-front war. On the Eastern Front against the Russian, and at the Western Front against Great Britain, France, and later on the United States. The fighting between Germany and France was known as the Western Front, The fighting between Germany and Russia was known as the Eastern Front. By the year 1915, the war settled into a stalemate as each side fortified their position with trenches. World War I is known for trench warfare. As you can see from this image, you see basically that soldiers are inside holes to protect themselves from getting killed. If you can see there, in between those holes, you have what we know as no man's land, and it was protected by barbed wire. And this was basically the fighting that took place between Germany and Great Britain and France, and later on the United States, in the areas of France. Very sad situation, as soldiers had to live there. No matter if it rained, if it snowed, they still had to be part of this conflict that became basically a trench warfare. And here we have an image of soldiers going over, coming out from the holes, the trenches, and trying to gain advantage and get the enemy unprepared. The soldiers had very little food, and whatever food they had was often attacked by rats. These rats were the size of small rabbits and badgers because they had fed on the decomposing bodies of dead soldiers. Remember, if you're in a hole, you do not want to get out, because if you get out, you were most likely going to get killed. And here we have trench foot. This is a condition that developed after soldiers were basically on mud, on water, on the trenches. Very bad situation for the soldiers that were there for a very long time. New weapons were invented to try to gain an advantage and win the war. One of those new weapons was the machine gun. Machine guns, such as the one shown here, slaughtered attacking soldiers and prevented significant movement of the Western or on the Western Front for 3 years. Long-range artillery, as you can see here, was also part of this conflict. The tank became another very important weapon, as it was able to move beyond the trenches and attack the enemy. Here you have another tank and how they moved into enemy territory. Also, airplanes and the Zeppelin became part of this war, as you can see here from both of these images. The flamethrowers and grenade launchers were very important. You see the image to the left, you have the flamethrowers. In the image to the right, you have the grenade launchers. Very important technological innovations that became part of this war. Poison gas, sadly, became part of this conflict too. Both sides used poison gases that burned eyes, skin, and lungs and killed thousands of troops. After the war, most countries agreed to ban chemical warfare. The submarine became a killing machine, especially on the Atlantic Ocean. As you can see here, this ship was sunk by a submarine. Now, the new weapons of World War I became dominant, as they were used to kill millions of soldiers and many civilians also. Those weapons included poison gas, machine guns, the tanks, as well as the submarines. You're more than welcome to pause this video so that you can read about them. New weapons killed soldiers more effectively. During World War I, it is believed that about 8.5 million soldiers died and about 21 million were wounded. By the way, there are other statistics and numbers that reflect a higher mortality rate. And you have a comparison here. You have the 30-year war, which basically killed about or close to 1 million. And then you have the wars of Napoleon, which basically killed close to 3 million. And then you have World War I, which killed close to 9 million. Again, especially on World War I, the numbers could be higher or slightly lower. Here you have a reflection, an image of World War I and how soldiers suffered basically in dramatic ways. You see that many of them have lost certain parts of their bodies. And, this is a reality of war. Fighting on the Western Front slowed to a stalemate as neither side could gain an advantage. During the 10th month Battle of Verdun in 1916, 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded, and another 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded at the Battle of the Somme. So you're seeing here how devastating this war was. By the way, once again, you can actually pause this video and read a little bit about the different battles and troop movement along the trenches in France. Despite the death, neither the Allies or Central Powers gained an advantage after these battles. On the Eastern Front, the Russian army was struggling to hold on against the German military. The Germans were too powerful for the Russians. Russia was not as industrialized as the rest of Europe and failed to produce enough weapons or food for its military. Millions of Russian soldiers and civilians died during this conflict, during this war. By the year 1917, Russia was on the brink of collapse. The stalemate on the Western and Eastern fronts turned World War I into a war of attrition, where each side tried to outproduce and outlast the enemy. Here we have a map of the different battles that were taking place and how the countries were struggling to keep up with everything that was going on. You see there Germany and Austria-Hungary fighting basically on the Eastern Front and fighting on the Western Front, which was very difficult for them to do, despite the fact that Russia was not being very effective during this conflict. Nations committed to total war to win World War I. Factories were converted to make war equipment. Industrial resources were rationed in order to prioritize military needs. Governments used conscription to draft civilians into the military. Propaganda was used to maintain civilian support for the war. People were very disappointed with this war as they saw that there was no end to it, and soldiers were dying by the thousands and thousands each day. Overseas colonies were used to gain resources or additional soldiers. Here we have obviously some of those movements that were happening around the world. For example, the United States enters the war on the side of the Allies in 1917. Brazil is the only South American country to enter the war. It supports the Allies with warships and also personnel. In Africa, the European colonies throughout Africa became a battlefield as the warring parties strike at one another's colonial possessions. In India provides about 1.3 million men to fight and labor alongside the British rulers throughout Europe. And both Australia and New Zealand, both countries fight on the side of the Allies and contribute many troops to the 1915 Gallipoli campaign in Southwest Asia. And in Europe, the main fighting of the war occurs on the Western and Eastern Front. Also, we need to know that Japan declares war on Germany in 1914, seizes German colonies in China and the Pacific. This is what was going on between 1914 and 1918. Here we have a Turkish cavalry. Here we have British soldiers in India. And here we have Chinese soldiers as well. And this is what we have basically, the alliances during World War I. You're more than welcome again to pause this video, and you see that the Allies basically had more nations than the Central Powers. The Central Powers were basically Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and the Allies basically included, Great Britain, Greece, South Africa, and many other nations. You're more than welcome to pause this video so you can see how the world became involved in this conflict. Now, to keep Germany from trading with other nations, Britain used its navy to blockade Europe. As you can see from the map here, you see how the British were able to, or try to put in place a blockade so that Germany would suffer. and not be able to move its military basically to different parts or different countries. Now, Germany responded by using unrestricted submarine warfare to attack the British Navy and any merchant ships supplying the Allies. And here you have an image basically of the ships that were sunk by the U-boats from 1916 all the way to 1917. You see that there were many ships that were sunk by the Germans. The British came up with this blockade. The Germans went like, okay, so now we're going to respond to you by sinking a whole bunch of those ships that are around your area. And they were very effective, by the way, and this actually scared the British. Now, German U-boat attacks played a role in bringing the U.S. into World War I. As you can see here, we have the sinking of the Lusitania, and this made many Americans very angry. When World War I began in 1914, the United States remained neutral. The U.S. did not want to have any part in this conflict, but the U.S. was pulled into the war by 1917. As a neutral nation, the U.S. was trading with the Allies during the war. Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare led to attacks on U.S. merchant ships and British passenger ships. President Woodrow Wilson demanded freedom of the seas, but Germany refused to do so. Germany continued to sink vessels, ships in the Atlantic Ocean, and this obviously led to tragedies. Americans were outraged in May 1915 when a German U-boat sunk the British ship Lusitania, killing 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. Here you have the headlines of the New York Times claiming and explaining to the people what had happened. America's anger with Germany increased, and in 1917, after the discovery of the Submarine telegram, Americans decided to go to war. Germany knew that U-boat attacks would eventually bring the United States into this conflict. So Germany proposed that Mexico attack the U.S. in exchange for the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Americans were completely outraged by this proposal by the Germans to Mexico. Because of all of the situation, on April 2nd, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany and entered the war. You see here President Wilson basically declaring war or asking Congress to declare war on the Germans, and Congress followed his lead and declared war on Germany. The arrival of millions of American soldiers in 1918 gave a boost to the Allies. But in November 1917, Russia signed a peace agreement with the Germans and exited the war. By the year 1918, the Central Powers were running out of supplies and tried a massive attack into France. But the Allies halted the attack and were able to push back. Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary surrendered in October 1918. On November 11th, 1918, Germany agreed to an armistice, a ceasefire, and World War I finally came to an end. Now here we have an image of military death during World War I. Nearly 10 million Allied and Central Power soldiers died in the war. New weapons such as machine guns, mustard gas, and tanks increased the casualties. Now, here you have the different breakdowns of how many soldiers died per countries, and it is a very sad situation to see that millions of men died for no particular reason. Now, we have come to the end of this presentation. Please do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next presentation.